Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help equip you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. And we're talking about a big question today, and that is, what is evolution? And here to help us talk about it is molecular biologist Dr. A.J. Roberts. Welcome.
Thank you, Krista.
When we talk to non-Christians and we express skepticism about evolution, that can kind of come across sometimes as we kind of sound like we're evolution deniers and maybe even reality deniers.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about this term evolution, and what are we talking about when we use this term of evolution or biological evolution?
It's a great topic because the term evolution is actually really packed, right? So it can basically just mean change over time in biological systems and organisms, but it also refers to a paradigm, an overarching paradigm that tries to explain all of the history and the complexity of life on Earth through materialistic or naturalistic cause and effect type mechanisms, physical processes, if you will, right? So it's important to understand that when we use the word evolution, we can actually be referring to many different mechanisms and many different types of evolution, or we can be referring to that overarching story, right? So we often think of evolution in the context of chemical evolution, microevolution, microbial evolution, macroevolution, and sometimes speciation. So it can mean a lot of different things.
So when that term comes up, we're going to have to ask some questions. What do you mean by that?
That's right.
Okay, because it could mean a scientific idea or it could mean a philosophical idea, it sounds like.
That's right. It can mean actually a specific scientific mechanistic process, or it can mean a philosophical idea.
Very good. So when we think about, one of the terms that you mentioned there was chemical evolution. That's a new term for me. So I want to know what that is and how does that compare with biological evolution?
Sure. So chemical evolution is sometimes the way that we refer to origin of life or the beginning of life.
Okay. It's like the primordial soup type of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Right. So some people might ask, well, is chemical evolution really like biological evolution? And the answer is no, because biological evolution involves natural selection or environmental pressures on molecular variation that allow the survival of the fittest, if you will, right? And so chemical evolution refers to primordial building blocks, like biomolecules, and those things aren't self-replicating. And until you have something that's self-replicating, you can't have natural selection working on anything. But origin of life is still a big hurdle that needs to be crossed if you want to talk about evolution, that story, that paradigm, right?
So if we're talking about chemical evolution, it sounds like we're going to express some skepticism about whether or not all the scientific case is in for that. But biological evolution, we might be more open to some forms of that?
That's right. I think that chemical evolution still has a lot of hurdles to cross, and we're not any closer to a naturalistic explanation of the origin of life.
If we're talking about genetic information, because I know the question of genetics is a big one when it comes to the question of evolution. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Right. So again, the evolution is sort of natural selection working on molecular variation. That molecular variation occurs in the genomes or in the genetic information of organisms, right? So there are some mechanisms that can produce that variation: mutations, insertions, deletions, inversions, recombinations. These are sort of the mechanistic underpinnings of evolution that we actually observe, whether it's microevolution or microbial evolution.
Okay. So that sounds like a type of evolution that we would actually affirm.
Absolutely.
That we've seen in real-time observations.
Absolutely. I think anyone would be hard-pressed scientifically to deny microevolution or microbial evolution.
So how do you think about the question of evolution within the context of you being an old Earth creationist or a progressive creationist?
Yeah, so I really think of evolution in the terms of molecular adaptation. That's sort of, it's a capacity that's built into the system by God so that organisms can adapt to changing environments and different environmental pressures, and as species they can continue to survive.
Okay, so it sounds like you're willing to allow for some forms of evolution, but when we think about chemical evolution in particular, or maybe macroevolution, we're more skeptical about the scientific case for that.
That's right, because you actually have larger hurdles if you start to talk about things like macroevolution. Now you aren't just talking about adaptations that allow species survival, but you're talking about a change of one type of organism to a completely different type of organism.
So very important to define our terms
Yes.
when we're talking to people about what is evolution, what are we talking about?
Absolutely.
And then to differentiate the different types of evolution and what the scientific case is for each of those.
Yeah, so hopefully this has been helpful.
Well, thanks for joining us, AJ. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't yet checked out AJ's blog called Theorems in Theology, just go to our website, reasons.org, and type in keywords theorems and theology, and you can read some of her blog posts that she's written on evolution that kind of echo these themes and explore them in more detail. I also want to encourage you to get connected with her on social media. She runs her own Facebook and Twitter accounts, and that's another way to interact with Dr. Roberts and her research.